Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast. Tonight, we are joined in the co-host chair by Dom Nolan. Hello.
Hello, Chris.
You are here because Rob and Sean sadly are unavailable, but I won't say what I said when we were talking off air.
That
To
their
be kind to
disappointing
them.
commitment to the call.
And very luckily, the quality is brought up by our guest tonight. We've got Simon Mason. Hello.
Hello.
Simon Mason is the author of A Killing in November and the forthcoming The Broken Afternoon, which is due for February. Is that right?
Beginning of February, that's it.
Which we will come on to. So please, could you tell us, as a way in, about A Killing in November?
Okay, well, I'll begin with the two main characters then, which are the two detective figures, Ryan Wilkins and Ray Wilkins, no relation. And Ryan Wilkins is what the Americans might call poor white trash. I suppose he grew up on a trailer park. His father's a violent alcoholic. His girlfriend died of an overdose, left him with a small child, now 3 years old. If you saw him in the street, you'd probably assume he was a member of the criminal classes. He sort of baggy tracksuit bottoms, Luke jacket, plaid baseball cap. He's got a chip on his shoulder, particularly about rich people, privileged people, posh people. He flies off the handle. His temper is a little bit uncontrollable. He doesn't have middle class manners. Ray Wilkins, on the other hand, is completely different. He's London Nigerian heritage, affluent family, privately educated. Oxford, double first in PPE, boxing blue, natty dresser, very handsome, suave, large vocabulary. And the story begins when Ryan is sent down from, or transferred from Wiltshire Constabulary to Thames Valley under a bit of a cloud. There's been an incident involving the Bishop of Salisbury. And on his first day in the job, a call goes out to alert the police to the fact there's been a discovery of the body of a murdered young woman in the private study of the famously pompous provost of Barnabas College, the smallest and snootiest of the Oxford colleges. And a call goes out to Ray Wilkins, who's precisely the sort of man who will be able to go into that situation. And by mistake, it goes to Ryan Wilkins. And so he ends up going out to deal with the very pompous provost of Barnabas. That's where it begins.
Brilliant. And why, without giving anything away, I don't think, why those two main characters?
That's a question I don't know the answer to, probably. I mean, I tend to always begin with characters, but they tend to come to me with just in a sort of daydreaming sort of way. And I think I daydreamed Ryan. He was the first. He just sort of, some characters gate crash, and he just sort of gate crashed, I suppose, my imagination. I couldn't get rid of him. And then Ray naturally sort of popped up as a sort of natural contrast to Ryan. And I think at some point in that process of daydreaming, I began to be much more interested in the contrast between them rather than either of the individual characters. And then the idea of setting the story in Oxford, which is such a city of contrasts as well, with the university so conspicuously, well, theatrically, sort of a privileged presence in the university, but actually with large areas such as Blackbird Leys among the most disadvantaged in the country. So I became interested in that contrast between the two characters and gave them a sort of a suitable setting.
Yeah. And is Oxford a city that do you live there, or have you been to visit for research purposes?
I do live. I live in the swamps of South Oxford. And I came here a long time ago, and I just basically got stuck. It's a very comfortable city to live in. I think it's a nice size for a family, and I got a job here, right? So I basically stayed here. And then as a writer, I think lazy would be the word, probably. I write about what's sort of in front of my nose, and so it's very handy to set things in Oxford. And setting a crime novel in Oxford is like the least original move you can think of, right? So I felt it was probably a strategic blunder But anyway, I wanted to do it, so I did it. And I mean, it turns out in a way, the fact it's not an original move became a sort of peg for reviewers to hang the book on. Oh, here's something very similar to what you've seen before, but a bit different, right? And so I think I got lucky in a sense.
You said you like writing about stuff you see in front of you. I'm interested about I mean, there's a lot going on in the book, quite aside from the contrast of the two characters and the Oxford setting. But you've got the murder takes place during the visit of an Emirati sheikh who's supposed to be funding something at the college. Is that because that's something I think that's particularly apropos at the moment, quite aside from the long-standing geopolitical issues with Gulf states in the West, but you've got this creeping relationship with the arts and academia and sport. We've got the World Cup coming up in Qatar, less than 3 weeks away. Is this something that you've seen in Oxford? This sort of Gulf money coming in, and this almost desperate sort of plunge by the colleges to get their hands on it.
Yes, I think that's quite well documented. In fact, there have been various institutes funded by controversial figures, where there has to be a lively debate about where is this money coming from, and the university has very often taken it regardless of where it comes from. There is a sort of complicity. And I think on the one hand, there's an argument that's sometimes put forward by the Oxford colleges that it doesn't matter where the money's coming from, it only matters what you do with the money. So if you use it for educational purposes, that's absolutely fine. It's not an argument I agree with. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it's a feature. It's a feature of life in Oxford. And one of the things I think is true about the university itself is it might appear like an ivory tower sort of institution, but it's sort of plugged into all sorts of international networks. It's part of a high speed exchange of expert information going out to businesses, to governments, to security forces, all over the world. It's an absolutely integral part of the establishment, and not just with a national influence, but with an international influence as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's something a lot of people are going to have to start tackling. I mean, I say it as a football fan, as a Liverpool fan, who find out today that the club's possibly up for sale, and there's only so many people that can afford to buy a $4 billion football club. And I think we've seen it in the Premier League with not just City, but more recently Newcastle fans.
Yeah.
A lot of football fans are prepared to turn a blind eye, which I suspect, as you're saying, is the same in academia, and will be something maybe that spreads into other parts of our lives on a regular basis.
Yeah, no, I agree absolutely. We're going to see a lot more of it, I think. And to my mind, that there are all sorts of questions. I mean, financial, obviously, but also moral, and they're not necessarily addressed. And you think of other things like the sales of arms to regimes that use them for all sorts of terrible purposes, And I think we're a long way from having a what I would call a civilized stance on that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting, Dom, what you say about Liverpool today, and the sort of when Newcastle were taken over, the sort of uproar from most other fans. And then today, as soon as it was announced, I had a quick look on Twitter, and Liverpool fans who I'd seen at the time saying like about the morals were very quickly, oh, I'll take oil money if it means that we can compete. And it feels like a sort of world at the minute where the speed of decision changing or moral changing is snappy.
Yeah, that's right. And, we've got the Qatar World Cup coming up as well, haven't we? And there are all sorts of issues there that seem to have been smoothed away by the exchange of large amounts of money.
Yeah.
I heard they're funding some of the hardcore England fans, like the lot that turn up with the instruments and annoy everybody else. Their journeys are being paid for, a lot of them, by the Qatari authorities, because they kind of want the cheerleaders, I suspect, on side in the stadiums. Which there's a great deal of thought on their behalf that goes into a lot of what they do. It's not just sort of randomly chucking wadges of cash around. There's strategic elements to it that I think are quite surprising. Yeah. And academia, perhaps another example of that.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Please, could you tell us a little bit about about your choice in writing A Killing in November? Like why a crime book and why now?
Well, this is my first crime book for adults, but I did write 3 crime novels for young adults. And so I think it was like I don't know, 2011 or no 2012 maybe, where I first thought of writing crime, and there were 2 reasons really. One was, to be quite honest, a sort of publishy writery sort of reason, which was my books up to that point they'd been very nicely reviewed and so on, but sales had been pretty poor, and I thought to myself, I'm doing something wrong. I'm writing for the wrong people. I'm writing because I want to get good reviews and I want to, I don't know, be shortlisted for prizes and stuff. And I ought to be writing to entertain readers and trying to get readers. So I thought I'd like to make an attempt to write in a more commercial way. And crime fiction is obviously a very commercially healthy sort of area to write in. So that was one reason. And then the other reason was really, no, 2 more reasons. One is I didn't, and I haven't really ever read a huge amount of crime fiction, but when I do read crime fiction, I'm massively impressed by the writer's ability to tell a story, to plot a story, to do that page-turning thing so your attention is completely gripped all the time. It's a sort of ancient art of literary hypnosis. And I think, the great storytellers have had that. And crime fiction authors do that probably better than any other writers in any other area. And I wanted to see if I could do that. And then on top of that, I felt, I feel I don't often make a good choice of subject in what I write about. It's a really important, right? You must know this, really important part of the attractiveness of a book to a reader. It's not just how well you do it, but what the subject is, and getting the reader to be interested in that. And I thought maybe I'm picking the wrong subjects, but wrongdoing is like always the right subject, right? People are just instinctively interested in wrongdoing. Starts very early on, he pinched my lollipop in the playground. There's a victim, there's a culprit, there are issues of, reparation and punishment and the effect on the victim, all these things. And I think as human beings, we are just massively attuned to that. We can't help it. We can't help ourselves. So wanting to move into an area where the subject was going to be wrongdoing of various sorts was part of the thinking as well.
Was it always going to be for a young audience, or was that something that developed as you started to? I mean, young adult's a term I find completely bizarre.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I didn't become an adult of any kind until I was about 25, and I've been regressing ever since then. So I can't imagine what a young adult even is. But I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, did you start out with that in mind, or did you start writing for perceived adults and just found it, I don't know, in a different voice or something?
No, it wasn't like that. I was writing for even younger readers. So basically, I started off a long time ago in the 90s with 3 literary novels for adults, and then
I read the one about the artist. British Nude, yeah,
right,
ago, yeah, but
so
which is very different to. Although it has the because I found out this afternoon I was doing this, and I hadn't read A Killing in November, but helpfully Amazon are giving it away at the moment, which might not please you too much, but I read about a third of it this afternoon, and the humor that I remember is still there. There's this caustic humor running through it, which pleases me a lot. But
I am a bit caustic, it's true. Yeah, but I wrote those. Well, I'm delighted that you read that very old book. Thank you. I was writing those books, and then knocked absolutely sideways, like lots of people are, by having children. It was like a massive upheaval in my life. And because of my aforementioned laziness, I started writing about what was under my nose, which seemed to be dozens of children. There were only 2, but it seemed like hundreds of them. And my books then grew up at more or less the same rate as my children, just lagging a few years behind. At first, they were books for 7 to 9-year-olds, and then 8 to 12-year-olds. And then after a while, I thought I'll move on to the next age category, which is young adult. But like you, I've never met a person who calls themselves a young adult. I mean, what the hell, It's a label that publishers use, obviously, like middle grade now. I remember actually when I first thought of doing these YA crime books. I phoned my agent and I said, yeah, I'm going to do this. And there was a long pause, and he said, oh, I beg you not to. I beg you not to. Oh, get therapy, whatever you. But look, that's such a stupid idea. There's an adult crime market, Simon, but there is no YA crime market. And the truth is, I think there is a bit of a crime market for young adults, but it's not anywhere near as big as the adult crime market. So what then happened was I wrote those 3 YA books. Funnily enough, the publisher who paperbacked that book that you read, Great English Nude for Penguin, back in 1990, read one of those young adult crime novels called Running Girl, and he got in touch with my agent and said, why is this idiot writing crime for young adults? He ought to be writing it for adults. So, of course, my agent was delighted by that. He rang me up straight away and said, you cretin, I knew that you were doing it wrong. Will you please now write an adult crime novel? So that's where I've ended up, right back doing crime for adults.
And at any point, did you think my agent's right, or were you so just wanting to get these out that you were happy to do it?
My agent is always right, but I hardly ever listen to him, and I can't understand how we've fallen into that relationship, but we sort of have. He just despairs of me. He says, you idiot, what are you doing? He phoned me up the other day and he said, what are you doing now? And I said, well, I'm toying with the idea for a picture book. He just said, oh, I'm just going to get off the phone. I can't talk to you anymore. So anyway, yeah. But no, he is right. He's a very good agent. And and anyway, I'm new to the adult crime fiction world, and it's an absolutely lovely world to be in, not just as a reader, but as a writer as well.
But I mean, you've had connections. I mean, you worked at the OUP and Barry Forshaw writing the Encyclopedia of British Crime and whatever. And also, I remember you did the rough guide to classic novels.
Yes. And
there's a pretty extensive crime section in that with some picks that perhaps wouldn't usually be, considered classic novels, maybe. I mean, it was a list I was particularly pleased with. I like lists by one person because I think a single person's list is like a fingerprint, and once you start doing it by committee, you just smudge the ink a little bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, the James Ellroy LA novels were on the list.
Yeah.
Which is maybe a more contemporary and sort of left field choice for that kind of list. I mean, obviously Chandler and Christie were on it, but so I mean, there has been an interest there for you, or at least you knew what you liked when you saw it.
Yes. This is very refreshing. I didn't realize I was going to be talking to someone acquainted with any of my backlists. so I'm so delighted by that. So thank you again. Yes, I know what I like when I see it. So I'm not I've never been a crime fiction aficionado. My wife is. She reads a huge amount of crime and will follow authors and stuff. I tend to follow my nose, and classic novels has always been a thing I really love. But my reading tastes are very broad at the same time. And if I find a writer I love, then I want to read more of that stuff. James Ellroy was a really good example of that. I mean, he's such a stylish and visceral writer and a voice like nothing else. I was just immediately captivated by it for really, I suppose, non-crime fiction reasons, just as a really startling example of how to tell stories. But, I follow my nose with authors. I don't know if you do this, but I read a book by an author, I love it, and then I want to go on and read, lots more by the author. So Lee Child would be a good example of an author I've gone through recently, and I'm currently working my way through the Maigret novels, of which there are 75. I'll be
you
dead.
Had Dirty Snow on the rough guide list, I think.
Yes,
which is one of my favourites of his.
Right, you remember it all. This is slightly terrifying. No, you're right.
I'm always happy finding a list that has things that I love on it too, because you're like, he must be right because he's got everything I would have too.
But what you said earlier is very interesting about lists, because you like lists to see what else someone else is thinking about or thinking of or liking. Yeah, because lots of people don't. When I wrote that rough guide, I remember I was interviewed by all sorts of people, and basically they all took exception to what I'd done because my list wasn't the same as their list. I think lists are like red rags to a bull, really.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, if somebody produces a list that's exactly what you would do, then there's nothing new for you to find on it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you want to find a couple of things that you love on the list, and then you're like, well, me and this person obviously see some of the same stuff, so Let's dig into what else they like.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, that's my view of lists as well. I mean, I don't know how well it did, and shortly afterwards, the Rough Guide disbanded their non-travel reference. I'm not sure if it was a direct result of a flop with my book, but they got rid of the whole list. I apologize to all my fellow authors. Actually, Barry Forshaw had just finished doing the Rough Guide to Crime Fiction when I took on the Rough Guide to Classic Novels. And I just commissioned Barry to do that encyclopedia you mentioned, a biggish sort of 2-volume encyclopedia of crime fiction. So we used to talk a lot about the Rough Guide folks, which was rather nice and supportive.
And is there anyone doing things now that you really like? Any new crime authors that you're into?
That's the sort of question I dread, because having said I don't really follow crime fiction. I'm plodding, as I say, I'm plodding through the Maygrays, and I'm still really interested in those. And then the what do they call the non-Maigret, not the Romandeurs, right? Yeah, the other, like Dirty Snow and stuff. So I've got those lined up as well. Are there any others? I mean, I go back to classic crime quite a lot. So Chandler is one of my favorites, and I reread him, I think, quite regularly. There's no, let's see. No, Mick Herron. Yes. So I've discovered him recently. I think he's just a class act. I do actually know him because he lives in Oxford as well. And his partner is a long-term friend of mine. But discovering those books, Slow Horses books, that was a great pleasure, and I've still got quite a few of those to read, so I'm looking forward to those.
Absolutely tremendous, and he does almost exactly the stuff any editor would tell you not to do. The way he opens the books,
right?
If I told my editor I was going to open it with the thoughts of the wind blowing through a building or something, I would just hear screams down the phone. But Aaron does it and makes it seem so effortless when he does it. It's just crazy.
Yeah, no, I agree. And in particular, I admire the opening. In fact, Killing in November, I was having problems with my opening, and I reread Slow Horses. And he's similarly got quite a slow and extended opening to that novel, where you're not sure what's going to happen. It's not like immediate in-your-face action, but he's so good at snagging the reader's attention and then building slowly towards something. And I reckoned it was something to do with the tone as much as anything else, actually. And so I took a lesson from that. I think tone is incredibly important in writing in general.
Yeah, because I mean, in Killing in November, it's thousands of words in until we actually get to the Wilkins brothers, as it were, coming into it. I mean, there is an extended opening, which is very. I was going to use the word evocative, but I probably have to punch myself in the face. But it's it doesn't just set up the scene in terms of exposition. Like you said, it is tone. You get to know the place, and I think you get the characters in immediately. Like, a couple of lines and they're in, which means you can go to work with them, and it means the reader's already involved. As a reader, if you feel you know something about the character immediately, I think you take them more seriously, and you sort of relax in their presence. And that opening, so good.
Well, thank you. But I mean, I do agree with that. Character is incredibly important, and tone is a really important part of that. I was in the bloody Scotland Festival, and I went to a talk by Ian Rankin, who said that after 2 or 3 books, his American editor rang him up and said, "If you're going to be big in America, Ian, we want the body on page 5. We don't want any of this extended stuff. I'm sorry." So it is a thing very often between publishers and authors, I think, about how you begin a book and about the immediacy of the action. But I take comfort in there's a letter that Raymond Chandler wrote to a friend saying when he was young and he was writing crime for the pulp magazines, he would often get editors complaining there wasn't enough quick action in his stories. And he gave an example. He said he wrote a passage which read something like, "He stepped out of hot sunlight into shadow that fell on him like a cool touch of water." And his editor crossed it out and wrote in the margin, "Our readers don't want this shit. They want action." And Chandler said to his friend in the letter, "I set out to prove that editor wrong. I think readers only think they want action. What they really want is the creation of emotion." And I think that's the real key in any literature. And you can't care about the action unless you actually are emotionally involved with the characters who are involved in that action. So I do think the really successful crime books, the ones that go on selling, have that aspect to them, that character is fundamental, even if they're very action-driven stories.
Yeah, yeah. I think there can be a lot of overthink in what readers want on an editorial level. He says, hoping his editor isn't listening. You said something earlier when Chris asked you, why these two characters, and you're like, I don't know. And I often think that's a problem with characters in books, that there can be this pressing need to have clear motivations for characters doing stuff. I'm like, I've never even eaten a sandwich in my life without having mixed motivations about it. So I think you sort of you press characters down into two dimensions by forcing simple or few motivations upon them for the acts that happen in the book. And again, we've been talking about Mick Herron. You kind of think about Jackson Lamb. You never have any access to his agency in those books. He's always seen from somebody else in the scene. You never go home with Jackson Lamb. You never know what he's thinking or really why he's doing anything. You only see what he does, and you kind of see the strategy behind it in the end, maybe. But the psychology of him almost doesn't exist. He's a cipher to many, and yet he also feels like a fully fleshed out character, because you learn more by accumulation through him. And I think that's where good writing, particularly in crime, maybe happens, and how some stuff can get slightly ruined by overthinking reader expectations.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And there is a sort of crime writing, or any genre writing, I suppose, where the novel reads a bit like the blueprint for the novel that hasn't somehow been fleshed out. They've got good ideas, there's a great plot twist and so on, but it doesn't come to life, I think, for those sorts of reasons. I read you might have read it. It's the transcript of the acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize that Kazuo Ishiguro delivered in Stockholm, where rather generously he talks about all the books that he'd written and what sort of problems he encountered when he was writing them. And one of them, I think it was Never Let Me Go. He said it wouldn't come to life. He had the idea and he had the story, but it wasn't coming to life. And he realized it was an issue to do with the characters. But when he looked at the characters, they all looked in themselves as if they ought to work. And so he couldn't work out what it was. And then he realized it was the lack of interesting relationship between the characters. So it's what you're talking about with Jackson Lamb. We see Jackson Lamb so often through other people's eyes. We see him in a network of relationships in actual fact, which is how we operate as human beings. He remains quite enigmatic, but we're emotionally involved with him because of this network of relationships. And I think that's true, that in a way in fiction, the relationships between characters are almost more important than the characters in themselves in isolation.
That's great. Did you know that it was going to be a series when you wrote the first book?
No, I didn't. No. I mean, I've recounted how I was shouted at by various people, and then eventually got round to writing the first book, and then it was I was writing on spec, because I hadn't written a crime novel for adults before. It was very much, will the publisher like it or not? So I wrote the whole thing, and then it went off to my editor, and then he liked it. And then that thing kicks in with, maybe it's going to be a series. So I think crime fiction publishers, they're interested in a series if it can possibly work. They don't know if it's going to work, but if there's like potential, they will offer not just a 1-book deal, but maybe 2 or 3 books to begin with and just see how it goes. And I'm still in that phase. So it was a 2-book deal. So the second one is this Broken Afternoon. And then I think they were pleased enough with the reception of Killing in November that then they've offered me another 2 books. So we're proceeding sort of 2 by 2 in a relatively cautious way. But, someone who was in publishing for a long period, I think that's absolutely right.
That's great to hear. And did writing a follow-up pose any challenges, or did you sort of just take to it?
Yeah, because I wanted to know, did you change the ending of the first one at all? Because it kind of, from what I can see, ends not in the manner you would expect a series opener to end anyway. I mean, one of the characters is in an unusual situation at the start of the second one in terms of them being two detectives working together. But
Well, that's right. Yeah. So no, I didn't think very strategically. I made, which I regretted. Although, funnily enough, I was talking to another writer recently, and she was saying sometimes you need to ignore your strategic self and push your characters into an almost impossible situation because that's exciting for readers. And then you've got to try and force yourself, now that you're in that situation, to get out of it. And it was more like that. But as it happened, once I started the second book, I did immediately think of a way to proceed. My bigger issue, in a way, was do I want to do that at all? I mean, it seems to me in a series you can sort of begin the second story immediately chronologically after the first story, and so on and so on. So you're creating a sort of continuous chronology. Or you can dip in and out like Lee Child does a bit more with, not always, but with Jack Reacher, or like Richmal Crompton did with Just William, where, 40 years later, he's still sort of a 12-year-old boy getting into the same sort of scrapes.
Simpsons-esque chronology, yeah.
Yeah. And I find myself, I think it's because I'm mainly driven by character, that I find myself wanting to work at a new story with the characters who have the experiences built up over the first story, so that they're changing and they're developing, and I think that's more interesting. So I think instinctively I decided to push on, and then I was faced with this situation I had to get out of at the beginning of the second one, and there's a similar sort of situation at the end of the third one, actually. So I keep doing this anyway. There we go.
Good. They're the ones I prefer. I like the series where there's actual consequences for the characters, and it's not just sort of a baddie of the week type situation with the books ongoing. So
it's interesting you talk about consequences, because I think they're really interesting and in lots of ways problematic. For the writer, sometimes they're inconvenient. And it would be nice to just have a big set piece, the finale, the outcome and stuff, and no consequences attached to it. But that's very unsatisfying in terms of being lifelike, I think. Consequences are so much a part of human experience that within a story, as well as in a transition between stories, I think consequences, like transitional points themselves, are almost the most interesting bits. And so I do try to, I try to confront those rather than smooth them away.
Yeah, I don't know whether it was a mistake, but I sort of horribly disfigured the main character in my first two novels at the end of the first one, which then had to constantly be handled in the second one in subtle ways. But I think that's part of what makes it fun. I hope readers latch onto that, because I think also it means there's something at stake. And
yes.
Readers can't be blasé about the fate of the characters.
Yes, that's another very good point. There has to be something at stake, I think, just like you have to be emotionally involved in the characters. And for me, a character like James Bond doesn't really usually work, with perhaps the exception of the last film, because he gets into all these scrapes and, do you expect me to talk? No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. Well, that's odd, because no one else does. He's not, he's definitely not going to die. There's another film about to come out. So, yeah, that can be a real problem. And it's a problem in a sense with Jack Reacher and Lee Child, but I think there he's sort of steered into it. And although the books appear to be real life, they're not at all real life, really. He's sort of a formula, and it's much more a sort of knight errant. Yeah, exactly. So you don't invest in the character in the same way, I think.
And can you tell us anything about book 2?
Well, I think I can, to be honest, because although Don was very kindly avoiding the question, the first bit of The Broken Afternoon is reproduced at the end of A Killing in November. So anyone who reads it and then reads that little first bit of the next book will know. At the end of the first book, A Killing in November, Ryan is dishonorably discharged from the police service. So in actual fact, at the beginning of The Broken Afternoon, he is working as a night security guard in a van rental business on the Botley Road industrial estate in Oxford, which is, as it sounds, pretty low rent sort of job. And it opens with him there at night, bored, turns the TV on. There's an announcement of, well, it's a repeat of a news announcement about the disappearance of a small girl in Oxford, a sort of Madeleine McCann sort of moment, you know, picturesque, beautiful little girl from a very rich family disappears in the middle of a summer afternoon from the very heart of really rich Oxford in North Oxford, and it's become immediately a sort of media event. And the detective in charge of the investigation is Ray, because he's there still in the force, right? So Ryan's in his little hut on the Botley Road industrial estate, and Ray is in a national news conference, talking about the case. And then you get two parallel investigations, Ray with the disappearance of the little girl, and that night the van rental place is broken into, and Ryan knows the guy who broke in, but lets him go. And then he's found dead. And so he pursues that investigation. And so they're two parallel investigations, but they intertwine later on.
Sounds great. And that's February, did you say?
It's the beginning of February. Yes, it is. Yes.
Great. We'll look forward to that.
Well, thank you.
If Rob Parker were here, he would ask, is there a genre that you've not gone to yet?
On Bond films to start with.
Yeah. Yeah, he would be fuming by now. He wasn't a massive fan of the last one.
That's one way of
putting it. His question is there a genre that you haven't gone to yet that you would like to?
I tell you a genre I have never been able to really get on with, and I would like to, which is sci-fi. And I've just never been a sci-fi person. As a kid, you read all sorts of stuff, don't you? And I did read a tiny bit and just didn't get it, I think. So I would like to get it. Again, in the rough guide, I chose sci-fi novels because I wanted to go there. But there aren't many, to be honest. And the ones I chose are more literary than what I would call genre sci-fi. It may be because I'm just really lazy, and some of them are really big, right? Sort of sci-fi fantasy thing, world building, great big, or they're multi-volume series, and you feel I'm going to have to commit, a bit like Proust or something, for the next 2 years. But if you've got any recommendations of sci-fi novelists I should go to, then please give them to me.
That's not really my genre either, to be fair. Dom?
No, not at all.
There we go. We're all in agreement.
Oh, good. I feel better now about not reading it.
And we always finish with what are you reading at the minute?
I am reading at the minute Nicholas Nickleby, which is a Dickens I've never read before. And I do read probably more classics than anything else. And I can't read lots of Dickens on the trot. They're just too big. So I read one and then I fall back exhausted for a bit before I return to it. But he is such an extraordinary writer. And well, I was going to say, well, he's not a realistic writer. He's a lifelike writer, but his characters are sort of more than lifelike. That you feel as if they have their own sort of animating energy. It's such vivid, wonderful writing that I go back to him a lot. What else? I've been reading Elizabeth Bowen, who's an Anglo-Irish author I'm very fond of, sort of mopping up the last few things of hers I hadn't read. I have to reach for, I've got my novel diary here. So that's a bit of a nerdy thing to reveal, isn't it? But I read a George Saunders book recently, Rachel Cusk. I like her. Oh, I had a Jane Austen jag as well. I went back to her. A friend of mine said Mansfield Park's easily the most interesting novel she wrote. And I thought it was rubbish when I read it the first time. So I went back. I still think it's rubbish, actually, which is a bit sad. Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell. I read quite a lot of poetry, so I go back to Robert Lowell a lot, and Elizabeth Bishop, particularly the late stuff. And I had a Tom Stoppard craze as well recently. I like plays. They're very short, right? So you can whip through them, add them to your novel diary. Oh, it's not a novel diary, book diary. Yeah, so that there are a few of the things.
Great. What about yourself, Dom?
I just wanted to go back to Elizabeth Bowen. I've named a character after her in my first two novels. There's a character called Barbara Bowen, who's named after Barbara Cummins and Elizabeth Bowen. The Heat of the Day is a particular
Right.
favorite of mine once you get past the convoluted sort of opening. But yeah, sort of very noirish book for her, I think. But I loved it. What have I been reading? I recently read Deepti Kapoor's Age of Vice, which is a sort of a Dickens-esque in that it's disproportions life in a rather arch fashion, but it's about the constructing of 21st century India and the sort of gangster families that are responsible for that. It's very, very good, and I think is going to be very, very big when it comes out in the new year. Also read Jordan Harper's new one, The Last King of California, which I know me and Chris spoke about. And he's got another one in January in the States coming out, which I think seems to have caught the zeitgeist over there. It's called Everybody Knows. Big sort of Hollywood noir. Everybody's looking forward to. Catherine Scanlon's Kick the Latch, which is a tiny thing. It's pocketbook size from New Directions. It's only about 120 pages, and she's a curious writer. She kind of makes like you get found poetry where people use existing documents, like Reznikov did with Testimony. She writes prose like that. So she wrote a sort of a novel, or I don't know what you call it, a fictional diary that was based on this diary she found of somebody in the Midwest from years ago. And now she's done this novel where she conducted interviews with a woman who'd spent her life working at race courses and in stables or on stud farms in America. And she's turned the interviews into these sort of vignettes, dozens of them, most of them only a page long. And it's extraordinary. It's somebody's publishing it over here before Christmas, I think. But yeah, that's very good. And what else have I done? Oh, and I picked up Black is the Night, which is the new anthology from Titan, stories inspired by Cornell Woolrich. I think Maxim Jakubowski edited it. I did that thing where you look at the writers in an anthology and immediately go to your favorite one, which happens to be the last story in the book. William Boyle, who's a fantastic writer that I have deep love for. He's written a bar tale, basically. And he's one of those writers that, like we were talking about the relationship between characters, he just seems to chuck characters together, doesn't really seem to mind about the plot, and just sees what happens, like billiard balls hitting each other, what's going to happen next. Usually awful violent stuff, but this is a very good bar story. And I'm about to start, or just am starting today, Freeze by Kate Simantz, which is out live the next year. Kate's a very good writer, and this is she used to work sort of investigative stuff for television shows, like hidden cameras, that kind of thing, like serious hard news stories. And she's turned that knowledge into a thriller. It's based on a reality show set in the Arctic on a boat where people have to perform certain tasks, and obviously starts going murderously wrong. But one of the characters is the sort of camera operator come director, and I think she's very good at portraying that kind of eye, the camera's eye, and the person behind the camera, and drawing drama from that. So yeah, that's very good so far.
Brilliant. I'm just about this. Well, I have started today at lunchtime. Jordan Harper's A Lesson in Violence.
Right, which was his first novel. Yeah.
Yeah. So I read The Last King of California and absolutely loved it, and then had a bit of a reading slump where everything I started just wasn't that good compared to him. So I got back from a weekend away, and that had arrived. So I've started it today, and it's taken off again.
That's a funny one because they changed the name here, which I think, Simon, happened to you in the States with your first novel, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Yes, and it also happened with a YA crime novel, which was called Kid Got Shot, which is unacceptable in America because lots of kids get shot, so they don't really want that. And they called it Kid Alone, which is like, oh, good, that sounds exciting. But yeah, the first one did The Great English Nude. I could never work out what the offending word was. Was it English? Was it nude? Was it great? I don't know. Yeah, Portrait of the Artist with My Wife was the title they went with.
Yeah, they sort of made it more convoluted than perhaps it needed to.
Yeah.
I mean, with the Jordan Harper, it was called She Rides Shotgun. And apparently Simon and Schuster didn't think people would know what riding shotgun was, which I don't know, maybe, but I think most people would understand it as a sort of a pop culture term. But somebody asked Harper about it on Twitter, and he said, like, even if people don't know what it means, it's a good title. Like, what the hell's a Reservoir Dog? Nobody can tell you what a Reservoir Dog is, and it doesn't matter because the title's so great that some titles just, that you just ride with it. And I think it was a shame they changed that one. But
it's not like it's a term that's not used over here. It feels like a strange choice.
Yeah. Really strange. And I mean, so sometimes there's that thing where a publisher will say, oh, it's too American, or it's too German, or too whatever. But I think people like to have a resonance of a title if it's an American book that feels American. There's that story of The Bridges of Madison County. Do you remember that? It was like it was a massive bestseller for ages and ages, but it was first published in the UK as black and white because they thought, Madison County, that's an American thing. No one will be interested in that or want to know about it. So they put it out as black and white, and it bombed. Whereas in America, it was a massive hit. So they changed it back to the American title, Bridges of Madison County, and it took off like a rocket, and people were perfectly happy with the American title.
Yeah. And then the movie came out, so they probably would have changed it back, even if it hadn't bombed, because what would you have done at that point?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We've reached the end. It's been great having a chat, and thank you so much, Dom, for stepping in at such short notice and hitting us with the zingers.
Thank you both very much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've scribbled down lots of recommendations for reading at the end, so added bonus. Thank you.
Good. Well, yeah, thank you so much for your time.